Britain Had Talent, A History of Variety Theatre, and Stand-Up on Being a Comedy, on being a stand-up comedian, on being a comedian, sorry, Stand-Up on Being a Comedian, deemed by Steve Bennett of Chortle to be perhaps the best introduction to the world of stand-up. He's also author of the excellent, thoroughly entertaining book, Getting the Joke, The Inner Workings of Stand-Up Comedy, now in its expanded second edition. Oliver's latest publication, a book he co-edited with Adam Ainsworth entitled Popular Performance, will be out a little later this month. It's already available for pre-order, hint, hint. Oliver's also helped establish the British Stand-Up Comedy Archive. You'll see some materials there on the table about that, and we'll speak a little bit more about that in today's talk. So please give me a warm welcome to the insightful and funny Oliver Double.
Thank you. I'm going to try and make this talk a bit like a microcosm of a stand-up show. And that applause was not a stand-up show applause. So I'm going off, I'm coming back on. I want some proper applause, okay? I want you to simulate entertainment and excitement, okay? So I'm going to go off. Actually, even better, if you could like start chanting, Ollie, Ollie, oh, I'm serious, right? Okay, so I'll go off, you can do that, bring me on, and then we'll have fun. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, Oliver Double!
I feel so cheap. Now, so stand-up comedy is, I should just say, by the way, thank you so much to Sheila for bringing me over. It is a genuine pleasure. It's been brilliant having so much time to meet so many cool people and talk about comedy. It's also been amazing coming over to the UK, meeting so many American people who all mistake me for Australian. Right? I don't know what's going on with that. Now, this is a talk called This is an Encounter, Not Recital, and that is obviously a picture of me there doing a stand-up show for a student audience at the University of Kent, where I work. And I think the still photo tells you something about the performance here, because if you look, you know, it's a comedy show, but really these are the only two people laughing. The rest of them, you're like, she really does not look amused. And I should also point out, this is just an innocent gesture, I'm not a Nazi. But anyhow, the point of this talk is, I'm talking to you about how stand-up comedy is created and performed. So I'm going to talk to you to start off with the first section, an encounter not recycled. What do I mean by that? Well, it comes from this. So this was a thing that was put together by a British comedian who I commend to you, a guy called Mark Thomas, a really important political comedian who is not necessarily, he was very big in the UK in the 90s, and well, he's sort of maintained a loyal fan base, but he sort of moved out of mainstream culture because he's not on telly anymore. But he does these extraordinary shows. And we have a thing called the Linda Smith Lecture in memory of another great British comedian called Linda Smith, who died just over 10 years ago, and more about her later on. But we established in 2015 the Linda Smith Lecture. Mark was the first lecturer. It's for comic performers or creative comedy come and speak about what they do, and he's also very funny about it. And Mark created this as part of the lecture, and what it is, it's his notes to self before a gig, and I believe it was inspired by a thing that Thelonious Monk did, that he wrote notes to self before a performance. So there's loads of really fun stuff on this, but this is where I got the title of the lecture from. This is an encounter, not recital. And what I'm going to do now is play you an audio clip of Mark talking about this point from his notes to self before a performance. So, just bear with me.
This is an encounter, not a recital. What is happening here is I am talking to you. We are meeting each other. We are meeting each other, and actually this moment in time, none of us know what's going to come out of my mouth next, including me. Magpie. The point being is, it's a one-off, it's an encounter, right? So we have to meet each other. You can't just stand there and go, this is my act. There has to be communication.
So there has to be communication. Now, with that in mind, what I want to consider is the processes of making comedy. And this is going to, I hope, pick up on a lot of things that we've been hearing about. So this is a show I did in late 2015, and the backstory is I went out for a very ill-advised early morning run in the snow, thinking this will be fine. But actually, after a 70-minute wait on the pavement for the ambulance to arrive, it wasn't fine. It was a broken hip, which was a 6-month recovery period, with including a sort of a month of being housebound, walking on a Zimmer frame, and relearning how to walk. And I'm the kind of crazy person who thinks, okay, yeah, this is really painful physically, it's very depressing, let's try and make a comedy show out of this. So what I did was, as part of this project, what I tried to do was to sort of document my creative process through that. And so what I'm going to argue really is that what I did in the show was a very authentic expression of authentic experience. But to pick up on Jason's talk the other day, in order to do that and to make it funny and to make it into a show that was workable, that would engage an audience, what I had to do was to use all the skills of a stand-up comedian. And through the process of that, I kind of documented the things I was doing to make that work. So what I thought we'd do is we'd see a little bit from the beginning of the show. Now, I didn't really know how to start the show, because I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I needed to let the audience know what had happened, and that it was actually quite serious, quite near the beginning of the show. But I didn't know what my plan was, to go out there and be really serious about how the accident happened, but then somehow break the seriousness, like in good relief theory style, that laughter would ensue, and I wasn't quite sure how. Luckily, a rogue punter laughed in the wrong place, and that allowed me to get my first laugh, as you will hear. Oh, there's some bad language in this. I should just say, I'm really relieved that people used bad language in some of the presentations earlier this morning, because I hadn't heard it up to this point. And because to be honest, if any of you are sensitive about bad language, you're going to be really fucking pissed off about some of the shit I'm going to say, right? So, here we go.
And it was at the top of that ramp that I slipped. And I'm going to pause the story there, with me hanging in midair over the pavement. Because that moment is the cusp. Shut up. I'm trying to build tension here. The joke's coming in a minute. All right. It's seriously. The cusp, right, between ordinary life as I've known it and a serious injury, which would force me to realise I'm no longer young, make me think about my mortality, and take me to the very edge of despair. Now you feel the time, don't you?
So why did I start with that clip? Well, because I think it relates to how what I've defined as the key features of stand-up comedy performance. Personality. It puts a person on display in front of an audience. Whether that person is an exaggerated comic character or a version of the performer's own self. And, that's me up there. It's a version of me. Secondly, direct communication. It involves direct communication between performer and audience. It's an intense relationship with energy flowing back and forth between stage and auditorium. It's like a conversation made up of jokes, laughter, and sometimes less pleasant responses. Okay. There was a rogue laugh at the back there. Somebody's channeling the guy who laughed at the thing. And finally, this is really important. It happens in the present tense, in the here and now. It acknowledges the performance situation. The stand-up comedian is duty-bound to incorporate events in the venue into the act. Failure to respond to a heckler, a dropped glass, or the ringing of a mobile phone is a sign of weakness which will result in the audience losing faith in the performer's ability. So when that guy laughed, I had to address it, but also it was a gift. And it got me out of my dilemma of how to kind of get the first laugh in there. So just briefly, we've heard a bit about me, but just to sort of give the background of how I got into this stuff. I started doing stand-up when I was an undergraduate back in the mid-80s, and one of my first shows was at the opening of Exeter Arts Centre in the southwest of England, and this is the costume that I chose to appear in. Yeah, and it was amazing. It was an amazing moment of discovery because I walked out like that because I just thought, well, that might be quite funny, and I got the most extraordinary laughter from the audience, with probably definitely some derision in there, and you know, I was inspired by that to improvise actually a huge amount of stuff that I hadn't even planned to do, and it was like I'd done a bit of this before, but it kind of sparked off a bunch of stuff. So. When I was a postgraduate student doing my PhD in Sheffield, at the University of Sheffield, in the late 80s and early 90s, I started a group of comedians. We called ourselves Red Grape Cabaret, and we performed around the UK in various different venues, pubs, art centres, student unions, and things like that. I started a comedy club with some colleagues called The Last Laugh, which was mentioned in the opening. And I ran that and compared it every week from 1992 to 1997. It's been run by other people ever since. Out of this experience and out of doing a PhD, I've written books. These have sort of been mentioned, so I won't kind of dwell on that. And then I moved in 1997 to start teaching at universities. I started at Liverpool John Moores University, and since 1999 I've worked at the University of Kent. Now, this is relevant because what I found when I started teaching stand-up was that actually a lot of my processes I wasn't even aware of myself, okay? And this leads me on to this. There's a great book by Robin Nelson about practice as research. This is a thing you may not be aware of, but in arts, academic subjects like drama and music and film, there's a thing called practice as research. And the idea of practice as research is that you can find out about the thing you're studying, not just by studying it from the outside, but also by practicing it in a kind of framed and informed way. Anyway, what Nelson does in his book, I should have gone past that, but what Nelson does in his book is he identifies different types of knowledge. And this is what I want to pick up on. So he talks about know that, and that's outsider distant knowledge. And that's the kind of knowledge that really, for most of this conference, we've been engaged in. You're not doing the thing, you're looking at it from the outside. You're a philosopher looking at what a comedian does. Now, I recognise that's not a simple binary, because there are also philosophers who are performers here. But you're kind of looking at it from the outside, you're critiquing it and understanding it from the position of an audience member or a critic or somebody who's not doing the thing. And then there's know-how, and that's insider, close-up knowledge. So that's experiential, tacit knowledge. So that's the knowledge you get from doing something. Right? But it's tacit knowledge, and it's tacit because you may not even be aware of it yourself. You kind of internalise it, it's just learned, it's learned from experience, and you know, you may not be able to articulate it. So then he identifies a third type of knowledge, and that is know what. And that's the tacit made explicit through critical reflection. And that is practice as research. You've done the thing, but then you read literature about it, you investigate it, you might interview other people who are practitioners, and you start to understand, you start to articulate that know-how. How is this thing done? And what I found is that both through my practice as research projects and also through teaching, it's forced me to turn know-how into know-what. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. This was my first project, my first practice research project, St Pancras, about having 2 kids with type 1 diabetes. And this is the follow-up to that, which was that from doing that, I started doing stand-up gigs for diabetes organisations about what the experience of either having children with diabetes is like, or being children with diabetes. And we'll hear more about that later. So, notes on stand-up comedy. So that's my backstory done. Let's talk about the backstory of stand-up comedy. Now, a lot of you all know this stuff already, but just so we're on the same page. So the origin of the term, for a start, is quite interesting. It's almost certainly that the form itself is older than the term stand-up, right? I've written a short piece about this for Comedy Studies recently, and I've written about it with other things I've done as well. Stand-up comedian in the US used to be mainly known as a monologist, and in the UK, front cloth comic. Okay. The OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, still has the earliest recorded usage of the term stand-up comic as 1966, which is absurd. It couldn't be that late. Because that would mean it wasn't used in the lifetime of Lenny Bruce. He died that year. Okay. And in fact, draft additions to the OED's entry on stand-up comedy or stand-up comic now date it back much earlier than that, to 1952. But I've gone one better. This is Variety, and in the nightclub reviews section, this is a venue called Slapsy Maxie's, which is a top quality name for a venue. And it's about a comic called Lou Holtz, and the review says, when not at his trade of stand-up comic, Holtz is ringmaster of the floor show. Okay, so that's the term used. What's the date of that? It's 1948. Okay, so we know that it does go back further than has been believed. Right, so to sort of look at the history of it, stand-up is believed to be an American form. And that's either, I mean, obviously stand-up's international now, but two of the most important sites of it historically have been the UK and the USA. And actually at both sides of the Atlantic, it's believed to be an American form. So Richard Belzer, the American comic, said one of the few art forms, he described stand-up as one of the few art forms indigenous to this country: jazz, abstract painting and stand-up comedy. And William Cook, a notable UK comedy critic, said British comics have adapted American stand-up to their own ends, but our parochial version is still way off at pace. Early sites for American stand-up include vaudeville, the Borscht Belt and the Chitlin Circuit. Many of these things have been mentioned by other people. Also just nightclubs and things in Vegas. But the key moment, the key sort of watershed really was Mort Sahl. So his first professional engagement was in December 1953 at the Hungry Eye in San Francisco. In 1955 he recorded At Sunset, which is regarded as the first stand-up comedy album. There are other contenders there, and that's it's always going to be a matter of opinion that. But it's a significant moment nonetheless. It's released in 1958, that album. By 1960 he's featured on the cover of Time magazine and recognised as the first of a new breed of comics alongside Lenny Bruce, Jonathan Winters, Shelley Berman, Nichols and May, Dick Gregory, etc. And this is a great quote from a book about Lenny Bruce. Mort Sahl so revolutionised the role of the comic that professional comedians viewed him with the same mixture of alarm and envy with which professional singers regarded Elvis Presley. And I think that's a really good analogy for reasons that I'll articulate shortly. So, I don't know if anybody's heard At Sunset, but if you haven't, here is a short excerpt.
Boy, I tell you, I was a fan for so very long, and now I'm getting a chance to work with musicians. For a long time, I was kind of a fan, and I used to read album notes. This is one of the albums. These albums come out of Southern California, and they don't have any of the guys on the cover, as you know. The guys are all talked about back here, and then on the front, they have this one guy who poses for most of the albums. And he's not a musician, but he has a peculiar type of talent, which is in keeping with jazz as a Native American art. And that is, he has acne and he's thin. You know, one of those kind of guy? So, that kind of guy. So, thank you. So that kind. So now, about this jazz thing, I wanted to talk about notes and why some of the albums, a lot of them are recording the liner notes as a speech, you know, and then writing the solos on the back. You know, this kind of. So. Dave has solved this whole thing. Now this album, which is just this concert, the one I was talking about a second ago, this is a little bit different, and I think it's a true jazz album. It's more in keeping with Dave's standards that you'll see in the film a little later, called Stompin' for Mealy, which Jimmy mentioned a while back. And I think this is the only jazz album as such that ever qualified, in that every time you play it, you'll notice that the solos are different, which is kind of weird, you know. It's not too easy to do.
So, right, so this is, I should just contextualise that by saying he was performing alongside Dave Brubeck Quartet. And so his comments there about the jazz scene at the time. So what's significant about that? Why was it so different? Well, first of all, it's conversational. It still sounds like a person talking to people. It doesn't sound like, ba-dum, here's a gag, here's a gag, here's a gag. It sounds like a guy talking about the world. It's informal. The speech is informal. He says, you know, the sentences don't necessarily cohere. He goes wrong. He stutters over things. It has all the mess of genuine conversation. It's unscripted. It's not from a clear script, and that comes out, I think, in the way that it's performed. It's an authentic voice. Okay, authentic is people have been picking up as it's a problematic term, but what I mean by that is it's the way somebody would speak. It's not a kind of character voice or something like that. It lacks obvious gags. I mean, some of this is mystifying to us now because we're not kind of hipsters in the mid-50s listening to jazz, and we're not sort of, you know, surrounded by the culture that he describes. It comments on the world from an individual's perspective. It's like, this is what the world looks like to me. This is funny because, you know, I've spotted these incongruities here. And finally, we sort of picked up on this, and this is why I think the Elvis analogy is good. It relates to youth culture, because in the mid-50s, jazz was part of kind of youth culture, and actually you can't really fully get the gags without being immersed in that culture, I would say. So it's about young, and he was young at the time, and his audience was young. So it's a young person speaking to young people, and those things were not part of stand-up before that point. Now let's go over the Atlantic and talk about the history of stand-up in the UK. So early sites for British stand-up are quite similar, but importantly different from in the US. So music hall, which was sort of analogous to vaudeville, as was variety theatre. Variety theatre was the later part of the music hall tradition. Working men's clubs, folk music clubs, a small number of comedians in the 60s and 70s came up through those. But the important thing is that the Mort Saal revolution didn't happen in the UK till significantly later on. And what happened was, there was a thing called alternative comedy. And I know there's a thing over here called alternative comedy, but we did it first. Okay? In 1979, but we ripped you off massively to do it, I should just say that. In 1979, May 1979, the Comedy Store opened in London. A guy had gone over to the States, he'd seen the Comedy Store in LA, and he thought, I'll do that, I'll even nick the name. I don't know how that worked out legally, but you know, that's what happened. And as a result of this, a bunch of people who were involved with alternative theatre, left-wing theatre and so on, who'd been experimenting with ideas of stand-up, came together and formed a group. And the group was called Alternative Cabaret. And the key members were people like Tony Allen, Alexi Sale, Andy de la Tour, Maggie Steed, Pauline Melville, Jim Barclay, and some others. And they had a residency, a pub in Ladbroke Grove in London, a kind of trendy area of London. And then they started gigging around London and beyond, and they eventually made an LP of their stand-up. And another key part of the early alternative comedy thing was in 1980, the Comic Strip opened, which was a rival club to the Comedy Strip, again ripping off a name from an American club. Alexi Sale went over from the Alternative Cabaret group, and he joined with more the student tradition. There was a sort of student wing of alternative comedy, people who'd been drama students and so on. Rick Mail, Ade Edmondson, Peter Richardson, Nigel Planer, French and Saunders. And then they had a guy who was also a middle-aged accountant who joined them, called Arnold Brown. And they were very successful. They had a venue for a while. They did a national tour of Australia. They did an LP. They made a film. They made a TV series and so on. Now, it was really, really different from a lot of the comedy that had gone before. An early article about this scene said this: it's a kind of antimatter comedy, the sort that makes you laugh while actually rearranging large chunks of your brain. So I think what we could take from that is that it was challenging to the audience. And what I'm going to play now is a clip of an unpublished recording of Tony Allen, one of the key early figures. And this was made on the 2nd of April 1979, over a month before the Comedy Store opened. So it's a really interesting historical piece, because it's a very, very early example of alternative comedy. And what's cool is that this has not been heard by almost anybody before in the world. You're hearing it, apart from the people who were in the gig, and I've played it once or twice before to small audiences. You're the first to hear it. Let's have a listen to Tony Allen talking about stuff.
The drug squad in Portobello Road. Police intelligence. Those two words are mutually exclusive here. The drug squad in Portobello Road. Plain clothes. They've got khaki anoraks, navy shirts, denim jeans, and sensible boots. And they're sidling up towards the ferry. Hi, man. Could you tell me where I can score some reefers? That's 1966 prices as well. But that's an improvement, because up until November they were wearing caftans and beads.
So, what's significant about that? So, I don't know if you get how much you can hear that. I know this sounds quite quiet. He's talking about the Ladbroke Grove scene, the alternative scene, I suppose, in Ladbroke Grove. He's talking about how the plainclothes cops are no good because they basically don't know how to dress like a proper hipster, right? And so all the laughter comes from shared understanding of these pathetic outsiders who represent authority, unable to infiltrate the scene. So what you hear there is exactly the same set of qualities as you heard in Maud Soul. You hear it's conversational, it's informal, it's unscripted, it's an authentic voice, it lacks obvious gags, it's a comment on the world from an individual's perspective, and it relates to youth culture. Now, talking about the idea that we ripped you off, alternative comedy was directly influenced by the innovations that had happened earlier in American comedy. So the concept of the comedy club was taken by Peter Rosengard, who I mentioned earlier. The names of the venues I mentioned before. The particular performers were strong influences on these early performers. Lenny Bruce particularly was an influence. And also, Andy de la Tour, another key figure, made a research trip paid for by the Arts Council of the UK to investigate the American stand-up comedy scene in 1982, paid for by government money. Right? And this is a letter in relation to this, and these are some notes that Andy took on his trip, and it's quite interesting. So these are quite faint, you probably can't see, so just to hear what he writes, this is his take on Richard Belzer, who I quoted before. One of the best so far, much harder and more political, a lot of freewheeling, like Tony Allen at his best. Right, so we can see that there's a direct thing. Now those things, the recording and those documents I just showed you, were taken from this, the British Stand-Up Comedy Archive. So this was founded at the University of Kent in 2013, and it happened because the personal effects of a comic I mentioned, Linda Smith, who died in 2006, were donated to us by her former partner. And it's an amazing collection of material. And we also had, around that time, taken delivery of a bunch of interviews with lots of different comedians by a radio producer called John Pidgeon. And this is from our website. It exists to celebrate, preserve and provide access to the archives and records of British stand-up comedy and comedians. So it contains collections from comedians, from comedy club owners and promoters and others as well, I should just say. But there are problems with trying to archive stand-up comedy. And the main problem is this. This is articulated by a guy called Matthew Reeson, a UK academic working in theatre, who has written a book about the problems of archiving live performance in general. And he says this: the ephemerality of live performance means that it must be consciously documented if it's not to disappear, with the primary preoccupation not the creation of new art, but ensuring the documentation of existing art. And if you stop and think about what he's saying there, it's actually implicitly quite critical of the idea of archiving performance, because it's saying it's just about it being backward-looking. Look at how things were done before, not looking to the future. He also says this, which is a very important point. Given the transience of live art, the live performance archive or museum is much more problematic, as it, by definition, cannot contain actual performances. The thing itself is always absent. Anything that is remotely associated with performance can belong in the archive, including material detailing the processes of creation, production and reception. So this is just a flavour of some of the stuff we've got, because that's precisely the kind of material we're collecting. This is a flyer from Alternative Cabaret. So it's an item from the very early days of alternative comedy. This is another flyer from those early days. All of those people went on to become really quite famous in the UK, including Rick Mail up there. This is was an important part of the spread of alternative comedy, an organisation called Cast the Variety, which grew out of the 1960s left-wing theatre company, but became a promotion thing. You could see through, as you trace through the publicity materials, you can see it becoming more professional. It starts off hand-drawn, photocopied things, perhaps screen printed, and then you get these professionally laid out things. We've also got photographs. So this is a photograph of Andy de la Tour, who I've mentioned, and this is again significant because this is back in 1978, like long before the Comedy Store opened. He was working with a left-wing theatre company called Belt and Braces as part of a roadshow. They did a Rock Against Sexism roadshow, and that's how he started doing stand-up. Some of them are just publicity photos. These are quite well-known UK comics: Joe Brand, Felix Dexter, Phil Jupitus, This is fun. The Tracy brothers, not well known, not well remembered, but the guy on the left, the taller one, is Mark Billingham, who's an internationally famous crime writer, right? And this guy, Dave Thompson, again, you probably don't know Dave, he used to be known as Igor Thompson, but it's now Dave Thompson, but you probably have seen his work if you've had children, because he was the original Tinky Winky in the Teletubbies. This is another type of photo, a performance photo, and again, a really interesting capturing of a moment of performance. And again, I'm not the only one who gets this kind of response. We have newspapers and magazine cuttings. This was an article celebrating or recognising 10 years of alternative comedy. This was from Arnold Brown's scrapbook article about him when he won what's now the Edinburgh Comedy Award. We have business records. We have loads of records from the London Comedy Club, the Meccano Club, which ran from the mid-80s to the mid-90s. And it's great because you could see how, you do this on computer now, but it's a notebook. And this is one of the things that fascinates comedians the most when they see this. Not least because they like to look themselves up in it and see where they were performing. And I don't know if you know how well you can see that from where you're sitting, but you see the names, in some cases you see the phone numbers, and above them there's a number. And that number is the amount of money they were paid in pounds. So if we look here, for example, just here, you can see that the bill was Phil Jupiter's comparing John Lenihan, who was an American magician and comedian who used to be on to Tony Allen, and it's me. And we were all paid £50 for our comic artistry. We also have vintage commercial recordings. This is the comic strip LP, which I mentioned before. We have unpublished recordings, and obviously we've heard some of that already. We have costume items. This was a thing that Mark Thomas did for a project where he walked along the wall, the dividing wall between Palestine and Israel, as part of a preparation for a show. It's actually a kind of pastiche of a Sex Pistols shirt. We also have props. So this needs a bit of explaining. I don't know how much you know about UK politics, but we had a coalition government from 2010 to 2015. It was a Conservative-led coalition, and the Liberal Democrat Party basically got into bed with the Conservatives and basically went against all of their promises. So this is a model of Nick Clegg, the leader of the Liberal Democrats at the time, and it was a piñata filled with broken promises, and the coalition agreement is sticking out of the anus of the piñata. Right, so we have the British Stand-Up Comedy Archive. You can look the catalogue online now if you like. You can find stuff, and you can arrange to come and see stuff if you'd like to see. That'd be cool. We also have a podcast, which you've got things on your table recognising. It's called A History of Comedy in Several Objects. I'm wearing a promotional T-shirt for it today, and then I realised after I'd arrived here at the conference today how weirdly up myself I look. I've got a photo of myself on my T-shirt, but there is a reason. Right. Every episode features an item from the archive which we examine in detail to sort of show how it reflects the process of making stand-up comedy. So this is a very brief excerpt from the opening episode.
But in his book, he says this, going back to that point about disappearance, he says the ephemerality of live performance means that it must be consciously documented if it is not to disappear, with the primary preoccupation not the creation of new art, but ensuring the documentation of existing art. I mean, what do you think about that argument? I mean, the idea is, well, it's a little bit pointless because all you're doing is preserving the past, you're not doing anything positive for the future.
So I think what we're doing is both of those things. We are trying to kind of preserve the past, but I think within the context that we are in, kind of an academic research teaching environment, we're definitely trying to kind of inspire new performances, particularly from your students who come in and use the material, comedians that come in and look at the material. So I think with our material, we're definitely trying to inspire those new performances.
Okay, so one of the great things about having the archive is it offers a really brilliant window into stand-up methodology, which is something that we've talked about in various sessions in this conference, particularly Jason's talk. So, moving away from the idea of just truth and authenticity and into the idea of craft. And that was also part of my research project around the Break a Leg show. And how I did that, how I documented it, was through a podcast called Breaking a Leg, which you can go and listen to online as well if you you'd like to. So this was just a short excerpt where I was talking about particularly the idea of using a notebook to write down ideas.
I don't like writing a script, because if I write a script and then try and sort of learn it and perform it, it feels like I'm doing a play, and it feels inauthentic, and I can't get that kind of conversational style of delivery. It feels wrong. And even with bullet points, as soon as you start typing something, it seems to give the words a greater sense of being sort of official and real. So it seems like you're actually writing a script somehow, even if you're making a note. Whereas if you scribble something down on paper, particularly because my handwriting is appalling, it doesn't seem to dignify it with being a thing yet. It's just an aid memoir for when I come back to actually start trying to prepare to perform it.
So yeah, there's a thing to do with, if this is an encounter, not recital, if I write a script, the problem is it's going to turn into a recital. I need to have the fluidity that comes with roughness and spontaneity. And so there's an inherent tension between form and improvisation, I think, in stand-up. So let's have a look at how that plays out with how other comedians work. This is from Linda Smith, who obviously I've mentioned quite a lot. This was from a series of shows she did, road testing material for a tour in 2001. And that's, so what you see there is a sort of printout from a computer file which she's annotated by hand to write in extra things to do with the particular gig that she's playing, so local references and things like that. And what's interesting is it's not like doing a play. There isn't necessarily a direct relationship between anything that's captured on paper and what's actually performed, you know, to an actual living, breathing audience. So to take one example, here we have a little excerpt from that sheet we just saw, and I'm just going to pick the first 4 words. Art, how long, minimum. Well, you can't tell what joke that's going to be from those words. So how would that sound in performance? Well, let's have a listen. This is an excerpt from one of those warm-up shows where we hear how that joke plays out.
Art's a tricky business though, isn't it, really? I'm a bit on happier ground with modern art, because you just know it's rubbish. You don't have to wonder about it. You think, oh, it's a pile of rubbish, isn't it? It's all right. No, it gives me no worries. But traditional art in a gallery is more problematic, because you see the painting then, you think, how long do you have to wait in front of each painting? What is the minimum amount of time without looking like an ignorant peasant who doesn't know what they're looking at?
Right, so you can see that you would not know how that joke worked. That's just for her. Those words are just for her, so that she remembers what she's got to say. She knows how the joke works, but she just needs enough words to help her capture that and not forget it. But it's not always like that. So this is another example we've got. This is, you can see it looks completely different. This is from Andy de la Tour, who I've mentioned a few times now. And so I should just contextualise this by saying this is about Northern Ireland. It's about the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And this is a routine from 1980 or thereabouts, where he talks about how, although the government is insistent it's just simple criminality that's behind the acts of terrorism that are happening in Northern Ireland, his insistence is that no, it's actually a conflict situation. And if the government would only acknowledge that it was a conflict situation, then basically it would, it would make the news more interesting, right? Because otherwise, how weird would it be if they reported the Second World War with the kind of rhetoric that they employ to report the troubles in Northern Ireland? That's the comic conceit. And what I'm going to show you here is a close-up of a bit of that. So this is the bit we're going to hit. Meanwhile, earlier in the day, 2 bombs went off. So he's imagining, the news of the Second World War in the style of how the troubles in Northern Ireland would be reported. Meanwhile, earlier in the day, 2 bombs went off in the predominantly Japanese towns of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No one has yet claimed responsibility, right? And we'll hear the clip in a second, but what I'd like to notice is he's got in commas beat there twice. And what that means, obviously, is that he imagines a beat of silence at that point. So it's a really detailed script. You can tell what the joke is just from the words, unlike the previous example. And not only that, but he's given an indication to himself of how he might perform it. So let's have a quick listen to that.
Newsflash. 2 bombs went off today in the predominantly Japanese towns of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No one has yet claimed responsibility.
So, yeah, what I think is interesting about that is that it's hugely contextual. There's a shared understanding. It's an encounter, not recital. You have to know that the word predominantly was used a lot. It was a key word in that kind of news reporting. And it's incongruously applied to a different situation. And you also need to know that the phrase, no one yet has claimed responsibility. So it's very contextual. Comedians' notebooks are really important. There was a study done, published early last year by Christopher Molyneux, who is a comedian and academic doing a PhD at the moment. He did interviews with 31 comedians in different countries, and the vast majority reported prefer handwritten notes to notes written on a computer. Joe Brand, whose photo we saw earlier, said, I always have hundreds of half-filled little notebooks everywhere with scribbled ideas for jokes or stuff I've read in the paper that I think would make good routines. Jokes tend to ferment in my head over a few days rather than present themselves on the page fully formed. So this is the idea of just capturing it, getting it down somehow so it doesn't escape. Notebooks are such a fundamental tool of the stand-up's trade that comedians even joke about them on stage. I've got 2 examples here. This is Mark Maron.
So I write these little ones, and if I write, I can't read my writing really, and if I write and I can read it and it makes it over to the yellow pad, if I can read it there, maybe it'll get out of my mouth. But I write things in these impulsively, and I have to have them at all times. I hear something I wrote apparently on a plane. There was a baby on the plane that was crying at such an irritating pitch. If I met her as an adult, I would still resent her. You gotta make sure you write that stuff down.
Right, similarly, Mitch Hedberg.
See, I write jokes for a living, man. I sit at my hotel at night, I think of something that's funny, then I go get a pen and I write it down. Or if the pen's too far away, I have to convince myself that what I thought of ain't funny.
Okay, so both of those examples really, I think, fly in the face of this statement by reason. Because the point is that you're not documenting something that already exists, you're making notes so that thing can exist in the future. You've got to write it down, you've got to write that stuff down, according to Mara. And of course, the reason that Hedberg's behaviour is ridiculous is because it's stupid to be so lazy to convince yourself the thing isn't funny. The thing to do is to actually write it down so it doesn't disappear. And the idea that that's the importance of notebooks, that's why you have to have them on you at all times, as Maren describes, because you don't want that idea to disappear, and therefore the emphasis is on the creation of new art. So this was my notebook that I did for Break a Leg. The comedy ideas, it says at the top, and this bit here, I'm going to show you a clip of that at the end if we have time. So that was the beginnings of an idea that you'll see a routine of later on. So preview shows is another important part of the comedian's trade. The material only becomes stand-up comedy when it's performed, with an audience, when it's used to create an encounter with the audience. And as a result, many comedians prefer tryout shows or preview shows to private rehearsal. So this is me talking about that in Break a Leg.
The first thing is, right, when big comedians do a big show like this, when proper comedians do it, right, they do preview shows for weeks or months first, trying out material with audiences, right. But I don't have the kind of following which would allow me to do a shit version of the show first. I've just got you, right? And attacks are coming, but you don't want to come more than once, that's my point, right? So, all I'm saying is we're going to be finding out, me and you, at the exact same time whether this stuff is funny or not. Which is quite exciting, or it could be a long night for everyone. Now,
So yeah, I couldn't do preview shows for this particular project, is the point. So I want to talk now about the creative possibilities of stand-up. And I want to talk to you about something that I've had some interesting conversation with people at this conference about, innovation in UK stand-up. So there's a guy called Stuart Lee who I urge you to check out. He is amazing, right? The people who know him, the person who knows him, is very excited by that. This is Stuart Lee talking about the growth of the sort of full-length conceptual stand-up show in the UK and why it happened. Oh,
but the conceptual show thing is also unique to this country, and it's about the fact that even now there's still enough mid-scale arts centres with funding that are a hangover from the 60s, 70s arts lab thing to have created a sustainable middle ground where the Josie Longs and people can make 30 grand a year doing their 70-minute Edinburgh Think show in those places when in fact they can't chop it up to play the Comedy Store.
Yeah.
Because it's not that kind of show.
So he's talking about the fact that there's a certain level of venue that is open to having comedians coming and doing full-length shows. And because that's there as a thing, it allows comedians to do full-length shows that aren't just a series of isolated bits, but are actually something coherent and long and satisfying, hopefully. So I'm going to show you some examples of some of the interesting things that UK stand-ups have been doing in the last few years. So first of all, this is from my book, Get the Joke, second edition, and it's talking about truth, which again, we've talked a lot about authenticity. Truth is a vital concept in most modern stand-up comedy because of the idea that it is about authentic self-expression. The boundary between off-stage and on-stage is blurred, and in many cases the audience believes that the person they're seeing on stage is more or less the same as the person they might meet off-stage. Audiences are so used to taking what stand-up say as face value, accepting it's more or less the truth, that some performers have had fun by exploiting their naivety. So this is Stuart Lee from his recent stand-up comedy series. And what he's talking about is basically berating the audience for not laughing enough at him. He's saying they're ruining his show. This is a comedy show on television, right? This is broadcast on TV. He's berating the audience for not laughing enough.
I'm glad this has been captured because it shows what an impossible. Every now and again, it is a very difficult job. This, you know, we lose. It's very stressful. We lose a lot of people to the. You know, like Hancock and Lenny Bruce, all these guys, because you have got a bit, and it always goes bang, 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 and then you have a night and you feel it melting under you, and you. I mean, audiences like you know, you're as good as murdered Robin Williams. You did. You as good as got the fucking noose and kicked the. You did, and this is what you think, isn't it? Right? This is what you think of. Oh, Robin Williams is mad. He must have been on drugs or drunk. That's what you think, right? You're like journalists. We don't think that, okay? We know what it is. It's 60 years of nights like this, where you've got a thing that's like that, and that, and that, and it's all... You know, we lose a lot of people, is all I'm saying. A car is a lethal weapon, right? You wouldn't get behind the wheel of a car if you couldn't drive, would you? No, and likewise, a comedy audience, right? Chipping away at people's self-esteem. That is a lethal weapon, right? And you should not be in a comedy audience if you can't follow the development of an idea through. Because there are consequences of your indifference, of your stupidity, and that is the fucking holocaust of dead comics that we have got. Lenny Bruce, Robin Williams, Hancock, all these guys. And the longer you do it, you lose people you know. And I mean, I was on a bill in Montreal.
You know, I'm going to move on from that because it goes on. I will just say though, I will just say that he goes on to pretend that he's surrounded by the ghosts of dead comedians, and the ones on this side are saying to him, "Keep going, Stu. Don't listen to them. You're worth it." And the ones on this side are going, "Join us." And I saw that, and it was one of those extraordinary pieces. But this is me interviewing Stuart the day after I saw the show, and he talks about that routine in particular.
And then in Dublin, there's a very telling, interesting thing that happened in Dublin, which is really profoundly depressing.
I noticed a woman filming it in the front row while I'm talking about how I don't want to do this anymore because so many comedians have committed suicide because audiences don't listen to them. Why do they do this? Why don't people pay attention? And a woman starts filming it on a camera phone. And so I sort of thought, well, I have to sort of do this in the character of where I am. So I said to her, why are you doing that? Why would you film someone in grief, remembering their friends that have died? Why would you do that? What's wrong with you? And so I remember room were laughing still, and then she looked embarrassed, sort of scuffled out. And then I went on Twitter afterwards because I thought I'm developing stuff, I'm very worried about getting uploaded to YouTube. I don't want to I don't mind afterwards so much, but before it's sort of finished or gone out. And anyway, I saw her on Twitter. She was a journalist for the Sunday Times based in Dublin. And her first tweet was, "Oh, brilliant, I can't believe it. I've just seen Stuart Lee have a nervous breakdown on stage and I've got film of it." Right. And so why she left was to begin work on her exclusive, right? And then the other people were replying to her Twitter going, "You know it's a part of the act, don't you?" She's going, "Well, it seemed, I don't think so, it seemed very real to me." The next person said, "No, we stayed to the end and it's all resolved." She's going, "Well, I've seen it before and this was definitely not an act." It sort of tailed off.
So yeah, an experienced journalist was fooled that what she was seeing was an actual nervous breakdown happening on stage. Right, this is a political encounter. This is Mark Thomas, who I've mentioned about. The Nick Clegg Pinata that we saw was from a show called 100 Acts of Minor Dissent. This was a show where he basically had a challenge that he would either be able to do at least 100 acts of minor dissent by a given date, and if he failed, he would have to give a large sum of money to the UK Independence Party, a right-wing nationalist party. The audience are often invited to join in his campaigning, his pranks, his acts of minor dissent. This is a thing he did. We've got a trainee shoplifter. They went around the swankiest London shops with these on, and they had a stopwatch and a clipboard. That was one of the. This is another thing he did along the same lines. People's Magna Carta, and he got people to put in suggestions here for laws that they would put in their Magna Carta. Some of them were very serious. Prisons should become a place of positive education and rehabilitation. Looking at the root cause of offences. Multinationals should pay tax on income instead of profits. We want the right to live in a world without nuclear weapons. Some of them not so serious. The right to arm bears. People living under the flight paths of any new runway should be allowed to put MPs who voted in favour into the stocks and throw tomatoes at them. And I would decriminalise blackmail, as I think it's a good potential income stream and could bankrupt the bankers. And finally, three-part demands. 1, we need human rights. 2, we should enforce them through human rights legislation. 3, we should lock up anyone who wants to take away human rights. So this leads me to sharing. I'd argue that sharing is just as important a component of humour as aggression. Laughter is a social activity. Much of what stand-up comedians do is about sharing feelings and experiences with the audience to create a sense of community. And I'm going to show you a clip of a comic called Josie Long, sharing in a very real sense.
And I thought that is a great start to the show, because this is a show about effort, and it's a show about how much I love people who put in the effort, regardless of how misplaced that effort is. And I thought I would reward audience members who put in the effort. I got these. And I just thought, if you were a big laugher, or you had a nice face, then I would throw a satsuma at your head. And that's partly because they're such a lovely shareable fruit, and partly because I don't want to boast, but I am really good at throwing. Like, really good. 80% of the time if I throw something at a bin, it goes in the bin. And the other 20% of the time it goes round and off, which is pretty much the bin saying, you are a worthy opponent, but not this time.
So Josie also works with the audience and directly involves the audience in her imaginative play. So these are audience contributions to the show Trying is Good. And these were scanned and included as a PDF in her DVD. And what was fun for me was finding the one that I'd submitted. The audience contributed. This is an example of something that we collected. We got one of the origins she threw at a punter, was then redonated to her for a later project, and we've got it, and we based the first episode of our podcast about it. I don't think I've got time for the clip, but you can go and check out the podcast later for yourself. So I wanted to finish with this, stand-up and intimacy. So Jimmy Carr and Lucy Greaves, in their book, The Naked Jake, name emotional pain as one of the still unacceptable taboos of comedy. But nonetheless, there's a recent trend of stand-up shows which explore traumatic personal experience. We heard a very brilliant example of it this morning from Kate. But here's some examples I've got. Andre Vincent is unwell, which is about his experiences of suffering from cancer. There are a bunch of these are the same theme. Smug Roxby, Dad's Dead, about his father's death. Jason Cook's Joy, about his father's death. Russell Cade's Smoke Screens and Castles, his father's death. Sean Hughes, Life Becomes Yours, father's death. Mark Thomas, Brother, father's death. And back to cancer. Tig Notaro did the famous bit about her diagnosis of cancer. I mean, people in the UK even talk about dead dad shows now in comedy. So I did my show St Pancras in 2006, and I think I will show you this brief clip. This is when my son Tom was less than 2 years old. He was diagnosed, and when he was diagnosed, it was really very unpleasant because he nearly died. He was misdiagnosed, he ended up in a coma. He had to get taken to hospital from Whitstable to London in an ambulance. We didn't know we would see him alive. And again, I thought this would be an interesting topic for a stand-up show, so I did a show about it a few years later. And this is a bit where I'm talking about him being in the intensive care unit.
They're going to arrive, they're taken for a brain scan, and they're taken for a brain scan, and sure enough, the brain massively swollen. They go, right, we're going to have to send for a retrieval team from Galt in London, take him to their paediatric intensive care unit. Meanwhile, we're going to go to our intensive care unit to make sure he's okay. And you can tell it's a really serious place, because you have to wash your hands with special stuff when you go in, and the lights were really low, and the nurses and the doctors are still talking about, what they're going to do tomorrow night, what they saw on telly last night, but they're doing it in really respectful tones, and it's really weird because I'm trying to be funny there, but hey, don't any laughing. And so it's weird because Tom is so tiny, and everybody else in the intensive care unit is old fellas with respiratory problems on breathing machines. And they're these big hulking bodies, and they're kind of coming out of the blue like this. And we're by Tom's bed, and I'm sort of trying to sort of like say from memory his favourite Maisie Mouse book into his ear, in case he can somehow hear me. And I'm praying. I've been sort of agnostic, wishy-washy thing since about the age of 9, and I'm praying. And I'm going, if you make him better, I'll go to church. It's not the funniest bit of the show, is it? It's not exactly hilarious stand-up comedy. But I think it's not a bit too hell, because he survives, right? And actually, I've got to say, with a bit of hindsight, the whole promise I made to God, I did keep it. I went to church once. I'm such a hypocrite. And also, I was telling Tom the other day, because all this has been going through my mind since doing the show, and I was telling Tom the other day, they were talking about praying, because I think they were doing something about it at school show. And I said, well, I prayed one time. And Tom went, yes, I bet I know what you said as well. Please God, don't let Tom die.
So I'm not going to show this clip because we're running out of time here, but I went on to do these shows that I mentioned around to diabetes organisations, including 1,000 to 2,000 people at 9:30 a.m. in Orlando, Florida. Like I say, I won't show you the clip. Now, so finally, transforming life experience into stand-up comedy. So how does that work then? Well, interestingly, this is the beginning of my ideas book for Break the Leg. And what it says is not comedy ideas, but broken hit journal, right? Because actually, I've written an article about this about to be published in New Theatre Quarterly. The main purpose of these notes was to create a personal record of the experience as a way of emotionally processing it all. There was no conscious intention to use any of this as comedy material when I started writing. But even on the very first page, there are ideas which eventually went into the show. So I think this is about this thing of, well, what do you do? You know, it's authentic, but you've got to do stuff to it. So it's authentic because it started as a diary, but then you do stuff to it, it becomes stand-up comedy. And one of the things you have to do is to give the audience permission to laugh. You have to let them know that it's okay to laugh. And there are a couple of points that I'd make about this. First of all, Bergson, indifference is its natural environment, is laughter's natural environment. For laughter has no greater foe than emotion. But generally we could not laugh at a person who inspires us with pity, for example, or even with affection, but in such a case we must, for the moment, put our affection out of court and impose silence upon our pity. So he argues that you have to have detachment. So how do you do that? Well, Freud, in his essay Humour, says he sees the other person in a situation which leads the listeners to expect that the other will produce signs of an affect, that it will get angry, complain, express pain, be frightened or horrified, or perhaps even in despair. And the onlooker or listener is prepared to follow his lead and call up the same emotional impulses in himself. But this emotional expectancy is disappointed. The other person expresses no affect, makes a jest. The expenditure on feeling that is economised turns into humorous pleasure in the listener. So what this reveals, I argue, is the concept of permission to laugh. In order to persuade the audience they're free to laugh at tales of unpleasant personal experiences, the comedian must show them that they've been granted permission to do so. I'm going to very briefly show you how I sort of did that in this show.
Before we go any further, right, there's a couple more things. First of all, there's a bit just coming up shortly where I need the noise of a wounded animal, right? And I've practiced this and I just can't do it. And I thought you could provide that sound effect. You look doubtful, but we're going to do this, right? So use your imagination, and with lots of energy and as much volume as you can muster, I'd like you to practice doing that after 3, when I click my finger like that, I'd like to make the noise of a wounded animal. Okay, 1, 2, 3. I was thinking of maybe a wolf, or an injured stag, not a damaged hamster, right? But okay, we'll go with that. I should just...
So, yeah. Now, finally, I'm going to just argue this, that stand-up and intimacy, it doesn't matter if it's crafted, it doesn't matter if you have to negotiate with the audience and make them feel it's safe to go along. It still creates a sense of intimacy. So Noel Carroll says that humour functions to build up and to consolidate communities, however ephemeral, should be apparent from the way in which we use it to establish contact with strangers. Intimacy. My premise, according to Ian Brodie, is that one of the characteristics of stand-up comedy, and one of the hallmarks of stand-up as a performative genre, is how it tends to be predicated on the illusion of intimacy, a disregard for the distancing of the stage. And this is from a very interesting article by Susan Sizer about the use of sexual language and swear words in stand-up. The majority of obscene words come from the source domain of sex and sex talk that are born and reborn in that realm of intimacy. Taking these words out of the realm of the senses to use them in the public address collapses the expected barrier between these experiential arenas, an incongruity that surprises. Likewise for those obscenities that are not explicitly sexual but nonetheless refer to bodily functions and the stripped naked basis of being human. And with that, I'm going to finish with this clip, where I'm definitely trying to create a moment of intimacy by talking about things that Susan Sizer just mentioned.
Okay, hit and run, hang on. Okay. The other really humiliating thing was that I got terrible constipation. It's like it's a side effect of codeine, which is one of the pain meds I was on. And in spite of the fact I was on really powerful laxatives, and I was eating tons and tons of fresh fruit and vegetables, I couldn't go for 4 or 5 days, right? And if you think about what's happening in the gut when that happens, it's like you've got layer upon layer of organic matter building up and building up, increasing the pressure until it turns to coal, right? And when I did go, eventually when I did go, oh my God, like the constipated maths teacher, I almost did have to work it out with a pencil. I love that guy. But it
you know, and the thing is, at that point as well, you know, I couldn't even get to the toilet. They had to bring a commode, because even on the Zimmer frame, I couldn't make it to the toilet. So they brought me a commode, and I hobbled over on my Zimmer frame and sat on this commode, and they pulled the curtain around my bed for my privacy. But this is a thin nylon sheet. It can stop people seeing what you're doing.